Tonight's presentation, although edited for YouTube, contains imagery and subject matter some may find disturbing. While our program is educational, we still feel that viewer discretion is advised.
As ABC's Bill Greenwood reports, there is a growing concern on Capitol Hill that parents who buy some of those games may not realize just how much violence they're getting.
I want to preface this video by saying some of the entries that we're going to be covering today are downright uncomfortable and not in a fun way. Some of these games are dangerous and if you run them on your computer could do serious damage, while other entries are so far out there in terms of subject matter and content that even talking about it and finding information becomes difficult and hard for a number of reasons. In today's video, we're going to cap off the series by going over majority of what we missed, explore some recent gems that came out after the Iceberg was created, and educate about some of the worst this hobby has to offer when we cover the lost and dangerous layers of this iceberg. With each layer we go down, entries will become darker, more controversial, and obscure. Today, we're hitting the bottom. It's no holds barred now, so with that said, viewer discretion is advised more for this video than any other in the series. But before we can get into that,
what did I do wrong this time?
I mean, it's more what haven't you done?
What do you mean? What's wrong with this?
You're wearing shades indoors.
Okay, so?
You're holding this.
It's Resco, I love Regretzico.
You're watching Sonic Underground with the volume off.
I don't want to get the video taken down.
Originally, this was just out of necessity. I feel glad.
Why?
That I'm
Why?
doing this.
What did I do? Why are you taking that?
I've been taking this for a while.
How long?
How old are you? Never mind. Yeah, unfortunately, I now have to tell you every time I do this.
Oh, because I got rocket money.
Yeah, I'm still gonna... I'm still... You gotta stop.
Well, I'm gonna tell Rocket Money to make you stop.
today's video is made possible by Rocket Money, a service that lets you condense all of your important financial information into one convenient place. At first, I was a bit skeptical, but when I actually got my hands on it, I found out that newspapers.com had been charging me roughly $20 a month for years, despite me only using the service for one video. Sometimes when you connect a card, a company will just pull and pull and pull without giving any notifications. Rocket Money, as soon as you connect your information, will just put that right in the forefront so you know exactly what is going on with your bank. Also, as a part of the 5-star service you'll get with Rocket Money, with just a few clicks you can have them negotiate your bills down on your behalf. No more waiting on hold or screaming at robots, because the fastest way to talk to a real human seems to be just screaming the word human at the phone. Rocket Money will take care of that for you. I personally was a skeptic, but they proved me wrong and I very much enjoy the app. So, with that being said,
If you want to know when your money is getting taken like a chump, you should really consider downloading Rocket Money, found in the link in the description or on screen now.
This Is Not Your House is a 2-bit choose-your-own-adventure style psychological horror game developed by Trash Eyes, where you play as Roger, a widower and veteran who comes home from running errands one day to find his locks changed and his house occupied by a bizarre intruder called the homeowner. Not only does the homeowner refuse to leave, but they have an identical counterpart, or analog, who will assist the strange entity in stealing Roger's car and clothes, leaving the elderly man vulnerable to arrest for indecent exposure, or even death by hypothermia. Part of the hook for This Is Not Your House is just how completely off the rails things can go, such as this ending, where Roger eats some suspicious mushrooms while naked and alone in the woods, only to undergo a psychedelic, ego-death-inducing trip that leads him to surrender his body to the cold soil and join the fungal network. The absurdity of Roger's situation, paired with the realistic consequences for his choices, such as being committed to a mental institution for trying to get help and protesting his innocence, does a good job of making the player empathize with the frustration and helplessness Roger is feeling. In another ending, The rage of having everything taken from him in broad daylight leads him to ignite the home inflammable gas in an act of scorched earth retribution. While it is possible to confront the homeowner and even win in a straight-up fight, violence can just as easily unfold in Roger's death, all while the circumstances bend just right for the aftermath of such confrontations to play out in the homeowner's favor. This gameplay loop of experimenting, trying to stand your ground, or at least reclaim what's yours, only for things to end poorly for the victim of this strange intrusion time and again, is a large part of what makes This Is Not Your House so unsettling.
The Hole is a first-person psychological horror game with retro PS2-style graphics developed by Bober Brothers and inspired by stories of the developer's grandpa, who they clearly resent. In the game, you play as an unnamed protagonist living alone in an apartment who seems content to spend his days guzzling beer and eating cereal from the microwave? Alcohol is actually at the center of the story that The Hole is telling, and while the protagonist may be drinking in moderation at the start, this will quickly transition to excess later on. Things start to rapidly spiral into madness after the protagonist's regularly scheduled vegging out session is interrupted by the sounds of drilling from next door, followed by the appearance of strange holes in the walls of the apartment. Peering through the holes offers glimpses of what seems to be some kind of dark secret or unsavory act being perpetrated next door, and worse yet, the evidence seems to point towards some kind of domestic situation where the neighbor's wife or baby may be in danger. While all of this disturbing evidence is coming to light, the apartment complex is deteriorating alongside the mental state of the protagonist, who begins to struggle to differentiate reality in a way that calls into question exactly how much of the game is a metaphor or a dream. In one such sequence, while navigating a looping section of hallway, we have a frank conversation about child abuse with the daughter of an alcoholic father that carries more significance than may first appear. Towards the conclusion of the game, after a clever sequence where someone is looking back at us through the hole to suggest that we may be the one with a dark secret, a connection is eventually drawn between the protagonist and a young girl named Agatha Varga. It's revealed that the character we've been playing as is actually the one who abused his family, which appears to have played a role in the tragic death of his daughter Agatha. This is a morbid reality that the protagonist attempts to justify, and when that fails, chooses to run from it instead. In one of the endings that follows, the protagonist is unable to cope with his decisions and the role he played in his daughter's death, and decides to end his pain permanently. If you choose to stay your hand instead of shooting, however, the game instead ends with Agatha's perspective, as she recreates the abuse she endured while using Matryoshka dolls, also revealing that the abuse may have had a sexual element. The game ends with a final message to victims of abuse in the form of a narrated end card, urging them to never give up and to seek help if possible.
No, I'm Not Human is a pretty interesting first-person survival game with elements of investigation and deduction created by the small development team known as Trio Scaz. As of right now, the demo version is currently available to play, with a full release being scheduled for the summer of 2025. In No, I'm Not Human, you play as a homeowner offering shelter to others during an event called the Cataclysm, where the sun is in the process of exploding and bakes the earth with intense heat during the daytime. This apocalyptic event has also been linked to the appearance of visitors, which are strange life forms that crawled from the underground and now prey on human beings. Visitors look just like humans, with only a few key tells that are revealed to the player each day, which include small details like perfectly white teeth, dirty fingernails, bloodshot eyes, and a blurry appearance when photographed. At nighttime, the player must decide who to offer shelter to, while using what little energy they have during the day to investigate the survivors for signs of visitor. Unfortunately, any given tell isn't necessarily a surefire way to positively ID a visitor, and when you do spot a tell, it begins an interrogation phase where you must decide whether or not to execute the survivor. Turning everyone away isn't an option either, since going it alone leaves you vulnerable to attack by a special visitor called the Intruder, who will kidnap the player for a game over if he shows up while there are no other human survivors present. Combine this with the fact that any survivor can be killed or taken away by FEMA to volunteer for tests, and you'll need to strike a delicate balance between trust, caution, and decisiveness in order to survive. Another interesting thing about the No, I'm Not Human demo is that it uses its framing interesting and unique perspective to create a uniquely paranoid vibe. Elements of the first-person perspective borrow from analog horror in a way that makes the gameplay feel more like a found footage or something you would see in the evening news, such as the censoring effect over dead bodies and the night vision effectively utilized in the evening that personally reminds me of the movie Quarantine. The art style utilized by the game additionally portrays every character in a way that looks off, with features like odd facial proportions, uncanny postures, and high contrast shading that leaves you always wondering in the back of your mind who may or may not be human. This feeling of paranoia combined with the helplessness of not being able to ID visitors with complete certainty and the uncanny valley design of the visitors themselves meshes very well, making No, I'm Not Human one of the most promising horror demos of this year.
Torture Arsonist of Evil is difficult to explain. Like many of the games on this layer, it is a point-and-click adventure game, released on CD-ROM that has since become abandonware. Inexplicable intro aside, the player controls fire investigator Sergeant Steele as he searches for clues regarding an arsonist which has been terrorizing Harrisville, Georgia. The game is also in real time, and Steele will need to gather clues quickly before the arsonist can burn down more buildings, or else he might become a victim himself. The area Steele searches are viewed from a first-person perspective, with the player able to turn around 360 degrees. These scenes contain not only a disorienting mixture of flat textures and 3D rendered objects, but also twisted evidence about a series of unsolved crimes that you can spin around on a clue examination screen like a messed up LA noir.
The story of Kamushiki Village is a resource management strategy game where you play as the leader of Aum Shinrikyo, Shoko Asahara himself. The Aum Shinrikyo is a Japanese doomsday cult that's known for several atrocities dating back from 1989 to 1995, the most infamous of which being 2 sarin gas attacks on subways in Matsumoto and Tokyo. Naturally, this game was believed to be propaganda created by the cult itself, before it was later revealed to have actually been made by Happysoft, the same people that made Hong Kong 97, of all things, as a parody intended to make fun of the cult. The game begins in October of 1989, just in time for the cult that the game put you in charge of to murder the anti-cult lawyer Tsutsumi Sakamoto, his wife, and child, which actually happened in real life. Over the course of the game, several events take place automatically corresponding with the dates the events occurred in real life, such as the aforementioned murders and the sarin attack on Matsumoto, with the goal of the game being to carry out the other sarin attack in Tokyo that took place on March 20th, 1995, with failure to do so somehow leading to the end of the world.
LSD Dream Emulator is an exploration-based game for the original PlayStation, which was inspired not by the drug, but rather a dream diary, which was written over the course of a decade by Cosmic Ace Entertainment employee Hiroko Nishikawa. The game saw a limited release in Japan, and also included a book composed of excerpts from the dream diary, which had inspired the game. Rather than standing for lysergic acid diethylamide, as with the drug, the LSD and LSD Dream Emulator has a number of interpretations, including In Limbo Silent Dream, In Lunacy Savage Dream, and even Lovely Sweet Dream. In LSD Dream Emulator, there are no objectives other than to explore the surreal environments by touching objects which warp the player to another location in the dream world. These dreams typically last for about 10 minutes, though they can end early if the player interacts with certain objects or if they die. After waking up, the dream you experienced is rated on a graph, telling you whether the dream was static or dynamic, and an upper or a downer. Playing through more dreams will cause a number of bizarre changes, from the textures of the environments becoming more alien and psychedelic, to videos sometimes playing before a dream starts, and even introducing a humanoid figure called the Shadow Man to stalk you. Touching the Shadow Man undoes any progress made during the dream, and prevents you from using the game's flashback feature to watch an abbreviated version of that dream, making it like it never existed in the first place. The game's designer, Japanese multimedia artist Osamu Sato, didn't really see the point in traditional video games, claiming in an interview that games never really caught his interest, and even that he sucked at them. For this reason, he wanted to create an open-ended and artistic game that even people who sucked at games like him could sink their teeth into. Today, Osamu Sato still creates psychedelic art and music videos, which are worth checking out on their own.
Workpool5427, or Robert Brock, was a game developer who, if you asked, would describe his body of work as one good idea with way too many sequels. I personally disagree with, as I'll get into later, but you may remember some of his games as Markiplier played through Presentable Liberty and Exploitable Money, which are part of his Menagerie series. In the Menagerie series, you play in the same setting, a world where a villain by the name of Dr. Money does everything he can to exploit his surroundings to get as much money possible, leading to the end of all human life. In Presentable Liberty, after a virus made by Dr. Money would rampant, only a few people are left alive by the end of the game. In spite of the goofy names and cartoonish aesthetic of Presentable Liberty, there is a undeniable quality in this game that invokes isolation and, more importantly, the depression that can come with that. The idea that you want to communicate with the people around you, and there's a metaphorical wall that prevents it, where conversations are one-sided, and the other person doesn't even know if they're even getting into you. When Markiplier played this game, he started doing the usual sort of mocking the game as he went on. He even plays a song, but as he goes deeper into it, the goofy voices stop and he takes it a lot more seriously.
Any inconveniences that might have arisen from the virus of our creation. Please accept this framed picture of money as consolation. Money Okay. Starting to get the picture here. Mr. Dr. Money. Sorry, he did not go to money school to become a Mr. People are dying. Their organs are failing because of an antidote for the virus, and everyone is infected. I wonder if I am too. Okay, so they made a virus for some reason, and then they made a cure for said virus for some reason.
Robert Brock's most popular series has always been the Menagerie. It starts with Exploitable Money, which is this cookie clicker clone where you have this money box that creates more money, and as the game goes on and you get upgrades, the ways you make money with this box becomes more questionable, to say the least. Of course, ending with the same messaging and theming that the entire series holds. Then there's Presentable Liberty with a strong somber message, and finally the Archive, which was the last game that Robert ever made. In 2018, after failing to secure money to remake Presentable Liberty and Exploitable Money, Robert passed away. His Game Jolt is still up, archiving his body of work that he's contributed to the horror space, which many theorize might give you an introspective look through his headspace through the art that he created. The only thing that I know is that Robert was one talented game developer, even if he personally struggled to see the value in his own work. And I know that if he was still around and different decisions were made, that there would be far more than just one good idea to make 1,000 sequels to.
Happy Bones presents itself as an RPG with horror elements, released by Frosted Fears on Steam, and is also free to play in browser on itch.io. You play as Laura, who hasn't seen her parents in years, only to suddenly get a message from her father telling her to come help them at a compound run by a doomsday cult known as the Family. The depravity of the cult becomes more and more sickening when journal entries and investigative reports talk about even children from an orphanage being sacrificed to eldritch creatures or twisted into those same creatures themselves. Even at the end, Laura finds her father having become one such creature, a fact even more heartbreaking as he retains his sense of self long enough to make one final wish to his daughter, to save her mother from the cult's god, who is far more horrific than she first appears. A sequel titled Happy Bones Infernal would come out on Steam less than a year later.
Actual Sunlight is a narrative-driven RPG Maker character study of Evan Winter. a chubby white guy in his early 30s living in Toronto and struggling with depression and not wanting to exist. Evan is lonely, unfulfilled, and struggles to motivate himself from day to day, seeing himself as a failure and pointing his resentment towards it all, both inwards and outwards. In Actual Sunlight, we see the world from Evan's perspective interspersed with various snapshots of his life and musings, such as transcripts of his conversations with a therapist, prose from the writing career he is trying to break into, and imagined late-night talk show segments where a more successful future version of himself is being interviewed. Evan's writing is sometimes sardonic, such as with the short essay, "My career passion is not to be stabbed by a homeless guy." It's also sometimes deeply bitter, like this ode to crashing out called "All You Have to Do Is Destroy Everything," but above all else, it's always deeply and utterly hopeless. While other games on our list have included similar warnings to the one preceding Actual Sunlight for their content with regards to mental health, we believe that some extra discretion should be exercised with this game. The issues that Winter grapples with are all deeply personal, yet relatable, and his story is written from a place of intimate understanding of the thought process and internal monologue of an individual with MDD. Combine that with some of the dark conclusions that Evan reaches, and it makes for a piece of media you'll want to be in a safe, healthy place before engaging with. About halfway through the game, it is revealed that the therapist in the transcripts we've been reading isn't real, and that the conversations Evan has been having were merely conjured up in his imagination. From this point on, the therapist's personality only exists to torment Evan further. After years of battling internal demons and promising himself that he would change his life to become the person he wants to be, Evan does eventually resolve to jump. In this unavoidable sequence, the player loses control over Evan, who literally sees no other option. Evan describes the out-of-body feeling he experiences in his last moments, mirroring a symptom of depression known as depersonalization. Evan's story comes to a close in the same way it began, desperately wanting to say something, but not really knowing how.
Bloodwash is a first-person PS1-style survival horror game developed by Black Eyed Priest and published by Puppet Combo's publishing label, Torture Star Video. In the game, you play as Sarah, a pregnant college student who has to make a trip to a 24-hour laundromat on the outskirts of town, after finding the washing machine in her derelict apartment building out of order. Meanwhile, a serial killer known as the Womb Ripper is still at large, making it especially suspicious when Sarah is threatened by a strange man on the bus ride to the plaza. After the introduction, the game actually starts off pretty low-key as you wait for Sarah's clothes to wash, engaging in some light activities like watching TV, reading comics, and playing with the game toy. Of course, this is all a bit of smoke and mirrors to distract you from the strange things happening inside of the laundromat, such as the appearance of this doll's head, or the front desk employee suddenly going missing. Another neat thing you can find during this segment is a bodega store in the plaza known as Peepaws, which has a video game section with a bunch of references to other itch.io indie games. While killing time waiting for the laundry, Sarah can also investigate the Womb Ripper case by asking people around the plaza about newspapers and missing posters, all while the tension is maintained through the threatening subtext of certain conversations.
Hey, you really shouldn't be out over there this late at night, not with the Womb Ripper at large. I know one of the girls who went missing. She disappeared around that area, and I'm telling you that you should really just go home. There's some things that the newspapers don't talk about. There's more to it than just the stalking and killing. It's a real psychopath, and you are right in the middle of its hunting ground. Do you understand? You need to take your laundry right now and get out of there as fast as you can.
Your free 60 seconds has ended. To have another late-night sexy conversation, please enter your credit card number now.
You look just like her.
Who?
Same eyes. Same hair. Oh, she used to be so beautiful. But I've lost her. It's been so long now, and I can't find her.
Oh, did you know one of the girls who went missing around here? Ma'am? I guess she's done talking.
Through Sarah's investigation, it's possible for her to discover a link between the disappearances and a fire which occurred years ago in the plaza and burnt down the previous laundromat. Unfortunately for Sarah, the dryer eats the last of her quarters while leaving her clothes wet, and when she goes to get a refund...
Oh God, it's the employee. He's been ripped to shreds. I need to call the police.
At this point, the game temporarily switches perspectives to Officer Burton, who responded to Sarah's 911 call after the employee's body was discovered. One thing especially chilling about this segment is the distorted baby's cry sound effect, which turns out to be coming from this creature, the actual Womb Ripper killer. In her attempt to flee, Sarah stumbles onto a secret passage leading to the old laundromat which had previously burned. Inside this section of the building are the corpses of the missing mothers, as well as their children's torn off faces.
Created by the developer Wrong Organ, Mouthwashing is a psychological horror game told out of chronological order about the crew of the Pony Express on their 385-day voyage hauling Mouthwash. Wrong Organ's previous game, How Fish Is Made, also combines horror and comedic absurdism to create this very poignant and deeply unnerving atmosphere where they commentate on religion and the hopelessness of the pursuit of knowledge, even if the game does contain a dancing number featuring a parasite. Mouthwashing, however, is far more in-depth and, in terms of subject matter, also far more disturbing and controversial. Basically, you have a crew of 5 space truckers, Curly the captain, Jimmy the co-captain and the character you play as most of the time, Swanasea and Daisuke in maintenance, and Anya as a medical officer, dealing with the mundane reality of working for a company that would rather put locks on medical room doors than literally any of the bedrooms, even when only one of the 5 crew members is female. We learn pretty early on that the character you play as, Jimmy, assaulted Anya, and now she's dealing with the aftermath, knowing that she'll have to have a kid on ship or have a unsafe termination. Furthermore, the other crew members who have been made aware don't seem to treat this with the same type of gravitas that one would think would be required, often resorting to ignoring the problem, or in the egregious case of Curly the captain, literally just trying to talk it out in hopes that everything will be fine. Jimmy, however, attempts to crash a ship after realizing that once he lands, he'll have to face the consequences of his actions, damaging the vessel and throwing them into free float at the mercy of emergency services, which may or may not even come. The crash left Curly mangled and in a state of perpetual agony for the duration of the trip, and being unable to speak, he is also blamed for the crash. On a little side note, he also low-key kind of looks like my persona I use for the channel, just in a alternate skin. This leaves Jimmy in charge, and through his arrogance gets everyone else killed, either through incompetent leadership or by his own hand. By the end, the only one to survive is the skinless Curly, who was put into the final cryopod, ensuring that his agony will continue either when they are found by emergency medical services, or in 20 years when they run out of power and he is forced to wake up again. This is a fantastic character study where your task is playing a Jack Nicholson's The Shining type. Not to mention the commentary delivered, the visuals combined with the fact that we're following a unreliable narrator makes this game a fun box to explore and talk about. If you're interested in learning more about this game or another perspective that we found to be pretty interesting, we recommend the video Mouthwashing Explained in Chronological Order Full Analysis by Rielse. However, to sum it up in one sentence, to me, the idea of spending 385 days with a predator who's now de facto-ly in charge is nothing short of a nightmare.
Although we've mentioned several visual novels on this iceberg already, consider this entry as amassing all of the disturbing ones that haven't been mentioned for one reason or another thus far. Quite frankly, we reviewed other icebergs and many of them are just filled with weird or esoteric visual novels, usually trying to cater to a certain taste or fetish. So if you were wondering where the likes of Higurashi, Euphoria, School Days, and Saya no Uta are, well, here you go. Another notable visual novel that would fit here is Raging Loop, which involves a young man named Haruaki who gets lost in the mountains. Upon stumbling into a mysterious young woman who rescues him and leads him to a remote village, the mountain god transforms some of the villagers into monsters during nighttime. These hidden monsters must be found and executed before they terrorize the village. If this is sounding a bit familiar, it's because you're more than likely familiar with the social deduction game Werewolf. If you like that game and visual novels, I definitely recommend Raging Loop. Kara no Shoujo, also known as The Shell or Girl in the Shell, is yet another intense, disturbing visual novel, taking place in a post-World War II Japan. The game follows Reichi, a private investigator who's investigating a string of gruesome murders, all of which involve young female students. Kara no Shoujo is structured into 3 parts, all of which are named after and based on the Divine Comedy. This visual novel stands out from most others with bloodthirsty, grimdark overtones, as it does attempt to somewhat distract and misdirect the player with a sense of comfort and safety with moments of levity. There are some we won't talk about here, mainly because if you can name a fetish, someone has made a visual novel about it. No matter how weird, dark, or disturbing, it exists. And for the most part, these games are made for very specific niches. Plus, if you're like me and are really a huge nerd about visual novels, you know that we'll be here all day listing off and talking about all the most disturbing ones. Despite this being layer 6 of this iceberg, here with this entry, we've only slightly gotten beneath the tip of the disturbing visual novel iceberg.
Going deeper into the iceberg, we're going to be moving on to Layer 7, or as we like to call it, the Lost Layer. Entries found here are meant to be disturbing urban legends compiled from the internet that are either completely lost, partially lost and somewhat documented, or what we found out recently, complete hoaxes. And on a side personal note, we'd like to take some time out of our day to thank you for getting this far into our video and supporting the channel despite my hiatus. With that said, Layer 7.
Homenzinho is purportedly an SNES game from 1995, created by a conservative terrorist group called 34-11. The game was alleged to take place from the perspective of former Venezuelan President Carlos Andres Perez, who was impeached in 1993 for the embezzlement of 250 million bolivars belonging to a presidential discretionary fund. What little footage we have of this game shows a few scenes of Perez being mocked and ridiculed by the Homenzinho, or Little Man, one of which ends with the former president being impaled on a tree. At the risk of yanking your chain, there's pretty much a 0% chance this was ever a real game. In our research, we were never able to find a terrorist group, nor could we find any explanation how the group would have been able to circumvent the Nintendo lockout chip within the SNES. This is to say nothing of the fact that Homenzinho doesn't even look like an SNES game, or that anyone is inexplicably speaking Portuguese instead of Spanish in a supposedly Venezuelan game. What seems far more likely instead is that the Hank Meller account, both on YouTube and the Lost Media Wiki forum post, is just a teenager or young adult messing around with some editing software and having fun putting together a Petscop-style ARG art project. While far less sinister than an underground propaganda game created by terrorists, can you really be too surprised when the whole thing sounds like a setup for a creepypasta?
So, I'm pretty sure most of you are familiar with Danganronpa, one of the more popular murder mystery visual novel series that has many disturbing moments in and of itself. The game centers around high school students with ultimate abilities being forced into a killing game by a zany, callous teddy bear named Monokuma. However, what if I told you that the original Danganronpa was meant to be much darker? Hardcore fans of the series may have heard of Distrust. Also known as Danganronpa Distrust, this was a proto-version of the first game in the series, Danganronpa Trigger Happy Havoc. Distrust still had the same scenario as the other main Danganronpa games, having a group of students basically kill each other while some psycho watches over them. Of course, there were quite a number of differences as well. Many of the characters in Distrust maintained their names in Trigger Happy Havoc, but were redesigned. This would not only be the case when it came to the students, but even the killing game host, Monokuma. Instead of the half-black, half-white teddy bear design, he originally looked like this. He had more of a humanoid appearance, with half of his body being skinless, exposing his organs, and went by the name Phantom. Another such change with Distrust actually centered around one of Danganronpa's most notable design features, the color of the blood. In Danganronpa, the blood is colored light pink. Originally meant to be a method to bypass censorship and possible controversies, the bright pink blood ended up being one of the series' defining characteristics. In Distrust, the blood was red, as seen in this screenshot of the school setting. The blood splatters in these scenes, which are not seen in the final Danganronpa game, seem to suggest that some students had already been to the academy and met their end. In keeping with differences that Distrust had from the final Danganronpa games that were disturbing, there were the body discoveries. That's not to say Danganronpa didn't have shocking and savage body discoveries, it's just, now that I think about it, calling them body discoveries in Distrust is kinda deceiving. Given you wouldn't find a body, you'd find body parts. One such scene involves a student's severed hands being discovered in a box soaked with fresh blood. As you could probably guess, Distrust was rejected due to being too barbarous and gruesome. The series creator Kazutaka Kodaka tweaked some elements of the game and was able to successfully pitch the game, now called Danganronpa, to the company then simply known as Spike. Despite getting scrapped, there are still several images and videos of Distrust available online, including the execution of the character Kazuo Matsuzaki, who was an early version of the character Leon Kuwata.
Gomon Master, or Torture Master, is a game for the PC-88 developed in 1990 by Kowloon Kurosawa, the same developer behind Hong Kong 97. Most of what we know about the game comes from an archive article of a Japanese gaming magazine, since while the files for the game can technically be torrented from archive.org, the game seems to have trouble running properly on modern hardware, preventing completion of the first level. The game takes place in an unspecified country in the Middle East, where the player is a subordinate of an also unspecified dictator. The player's task is to torture prisoners until they achieve a confession inside of a time limit. Apply too much pressure, and the prisoner will die. But go too easy, and you'll run out of time before they confess, leading to brutal punishments for the player. The game disc also contained a short preface titled Mr. Takushi's Green Beret-style torture. While we don't actually speak Japanese, it seems to contain the reminiscences of someone claiming to have been a former Green Beret and their time spent torturing the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War. It outlines various tortures, including using bamboo skewers to gouge at the fingernails, beating the temples of prisoners with bags of sand, and a twist on the Chinese water torture technique involving oil. After promising to release other versions of the game, Mr. Takushi wishes you success and happy torture.
Fun in the Playground, also known as Blood in the Playground, is a short visual novel-style game developed by Christian Means, where the twist is kid death. Very little information still exists online about this title, which appears to have been removed from itch.io sometime around 2021 for unknown reasons. The only gameplay footage we are able to find comes from a YouTube channel that literally hasn't posted in 5 years, giving us insight to only one of the game's endings. In the game, you play as a schoolboy named Jackson, who struggles to make friends because of his buck teeth, only for his luck to turn around when he encounters a new playmate of the player's choosing. At risk of speculating, it seems as though there would have eventually been 3 routes to choose from, representing 3 different potential friendships that would all end in disaster, though at the time of the recording of the Let's Play, the only available route is a beautiful girl. In this beautiful girl route, Jackson's new friend is a younger girl named Mika who seems to take an instant, inexplicable liking to him. Around the same time, a news story begins to circulate about a 3rd grader found mutilated in a ditch, foreshadowing the danger Jackson is in without even realizing. On the 3rd day of being Mika's friend, she promises Jackson a gift on the condition that he will follow her, only to lead the unsuspecting boy to the titular ditch instead. This is probably the game's single cool moment, since the real-life picture which was used for this location is genuinely certainly pretty creepy. After stupidly agreeing to close his eyes for a big surprise, Jackson realizes that Mika is now holding him at knife point to trauma dump about her alcoholic father. It's then awkwardly and very unceremoniously revealed that Mika has a vendetta against all men apparently, after her father made advances on her, to which she retaliated by saving herself and killing the abuser. Jackson cries out for help, only to be saved by his mother in the last second, who seemingly also kills Mika in the process. Considering the kids' ages, it's hard to tell how that one would play out in court. A brutal ending to a twisted little vignette. If you ask us, fun in the playground seems like the handiwork of a very young person, especially considering the art style and the fact that the game opens up with an oddly specific disclaimer stating that people under 14 shouldn't play this game. It isn't much of a stretch to say that the developer likely grew embarrassed of their amateur work as they got older, removing the game and quietly letting the time that they made a weird visual novel about SA fade into obscurity.
Rendition Guantanamo is a cancelled Xbox 360 game which was being developed by a Scottish company called The Enterprise and would have casted the player as Adam, a prisoner attempting to escape the notorious Guantanamo Bay. In the wake of the September 11th attacks, the Bush administration established the Guantanamo Bay detention camp at a naval base in Cuba in order to hold terrorism suspects, illegal enemy combatants, and foreign nationals indefinitely and without formal charge. The camp managed to skirt around protections and rights offered to those accused of a crime in the United States by being located off of American soil, and, in addition to abusing its prisoners and keeping them in unfit conditions, regularly tortured inmates through what the CIA refers to as enhanced interrogation techniques. Out of the 780 prisoners who have passed through Gitmo, only 16 were ever charged by the US with criminal offenses. Rendition Guantanamo was being developed in 2009 when Barack Obama had been making plans to shut down the detention camp. However, at the time of writing this, 27 detainees still remain at Guantanamo Bay. Hearing all of this, you might assume that the controversy surrounding Rendition Guantanamo might have had something to do with gamifying the very real stories of prisoners of the War on Terror who had their human rights violated by the US government. From our perspective at least, it didn't exactly have the makings of a tasteful shooter game, especially based on this trailer and its tagline, "It's time to fight back." Instead, a majority of the pressure placed on the developers came from a group called Vets for Freedom, which was established by combat veterans of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The group took issue with not only Rendition Guantanamo painting American soldiers as the enemy and detainees as the heroes, but also for the game's inclusion of British speaker and activist Mozam Beg. Mozam Beg had been detained for 3 years at Guantanamo Bay, where he watched 2 men be beaten to death by guards, and was later brought on as a consultant to the game. As well as acting as a consultant, Mozam Beg was also 3D rendered into the game, and eventually even given full creative control over the project. This would become one of the main points of contention against the game for the Vets for Freedom group, who believed that Beg would be cast as the protagonist of the game. Mainstream media outlets would even go as far as to claim that Rendition Guantanamo was a piece of Al-Qaeda propaganda in the making. In the wake of the game's cancellation, the director of T Enterprise, Zarar Sheshti, would go on to release an official statement, refuting claims that Rendition Guantanamo was in any way connected to the Al-Qaeda terrorist group, or that Mozam Beg would be the game's protagonist.
Produced by PowerNut and the Chinese Communist Youth League, Heroes of the Anti-Japan War is an MMORPG where you play as a Chinese soldier defending China from invading Japanese in World War II. As a soldier, you are expected to grind against mobs of Japanese troops that the developers intentionally made subtly uglier to make the process more satisfying for the player, at least if the propaganda episode of Extra Credits is to be believed. According to several posts we can find, this game would allow especially younger players to learn from history. There is no Metacritic rating, and scant few articles remain up even talking about anti-Japan war. And as of today, there's not much remaining from this game, outside of a couple of screenshots and a trailer. Considering this is a Chinese MMO, released between 2005 and 2008, it's unlikely this game is still running, and at least stateside, it's lost media.
Garage: Bad Dream Adventure. found. Garage Bad Dream Adventure is a point-and-click adventure game with puzzle-solving elements developed by Kinotrope. Garage was written and directed by Japanese surrealist Tomomi Sakuba, which is likely why it's often compared to Chutang, directed by Osamu Sato. When the game was released in early 1999, only 3,000 copies were produced, leading to the game becoming quite rare and expensive for a time due to the scarcity. A private edition of Garage with bonus concept art was available on Sakuba's website in 2004. However, this was an even more limited release, and all 90 copies sold out in a single day. In response to how expensive the rare game had become, members of the 4chan board VR, who were interested in preserving the game, pooled their funds together to purchase Garage from a Japanese auction website. It was then that the game began its long journey from Japan to the US and finally Australia, where Garage was ripped and uploaded for the online community by hg101.proboards.com user CC0. Fast forward to 2021, and a remastered version of Garage, fully playable in English and even featuring new content, was released for Android and iOS, followed by a Steam release in 2022. Considering that the game thankfully no longer qualifies for the lost media layer of Iceberg, we would have instead placed it in the bizarre and trippy layer among other surreal titles that bring the twisted logic of a bad dream to life. Garage has a very gloomy art style, with dilapidated buildings and rusted, crumbling infrastructure, which may be inspired by the Kowloon Wall City. One iconic quirk of Garage's art style is that most characters have an organic head and a robot body. This includes the player character, a man named Yang, who awakens as a biomechanical organism inside the strange dystopian world of Garage, which is simultaneously a therapeutic machine. From there, Yang must solve puzzles, locate a mysterious entity known as his shadow, and escape the city. While not necessarily a horror game in content or presentation, the distinctive visuals of the game seems to have really stuck with some, and for a time, those disquieting memories were all that remained.
Soft and Cuddley was a side-scrolling schlock horror platformer for the ZX Spectrum. It was developed in 1987 by the creator of another game called Go to Hell, John George Jones. The eccentric story of the game is told to the player through the inlay included with the box. This was common for games at the time. You play as the son of an android queen who was badly damaged in an accident and has had her body parts scattered across the map. Now armed with a jetpack and laser gun, the player's goal is to explore and fight their way through various screens in order to retrieve their mother's parts and sew them back together. Also there to help you locate these parts is your father, who had been locked away in a refrigerator filled with evil spirits by the android queen for unrelated reasons. In an interview for the 1987 edition of the gaming magazine Sinclair User, when confronted about the grotesque nature of the game, Jones references a far more disgusting original version which remains lost media to this day. Specifically, he mentions infants being, and I quote here, ripped apart, and sheep bouncing up and down on the cadaver. While it's impossible to say how hard this pre-release version of the game would have gone, from our read, John George Jones seems like a pretty irreverent guy with an interest in pushing the envelope. If given the freedom to make whatever he wanted with no limits, it sounds like Jones could have come up with something pretty grisly for the 1980s.
This entry is quite an interesting one for a multitude of reasons. For starters, this game's placement in the Iceberg comes with a technicality, as it isn't really lost, but unreleased. Thrill Kill was a fighting game originally planned for a 1998 release for the PlayStation. The game actually started out as a sports game that involved characters attempting to get a ball through a hoop while they attacked one another, reminiscent of the Mesoamerican ball game. Virgin Interactive, the game's publisher, had reportedly pushed developer Paradox Development to make a more violent game. This led to the dev team scrapping the sports elements in favor of a fighting game format, amping up the violence and adding elements of dark fantasy and BDSM. These changes resulted in the game getting a lot more intrigue from fans and being one of the earliest games to get an adults-only rating from the ESRB. Thrill Kill was also somewhat innovative in terms of its gameplay format. It was a 3D arena fighter that could have up to 4 players, preceding even the likes of more notable fighting games with a similar format, such as Capcom's Power Stone, more specifically Power Stone 2, which was released in the year 2000. Of course, this isn't what people talk about when it comes to Thrill Kill. The game takes the over-the-top, bloodthirsty nature of Mortal Kombat even further, and mixes it with sexual bondage themes. Thrill Kill even has its own take on fatalities, which themselves are called Thrill Kills. In addition to the weird, gory finishers, Thrill Kill has a pretty grim and wicked plot. Instead of the typical mixture of heroic, neutral, and sinister characters, most of the characters are varying degrees of evil. Their devilry is what results in them being sent to hell, and rather than suffering eternal damnation, they are pitted against each other in a tournament, with the prize being a chance at being reincarnated. Thrill Kill never saw an official release, as the North American branch of Virgin Interactive would be purchased by EA. Around 2 weeks after this acquisition, EA discontinued Thrill Kill despite the game being nearly completed and even having a planned sequel. The company found the game too violent and feared it would be damaging to their reputation if they released it. EA even turned down several offers to sell the game to other publishers. Some Paradox employees suspect that EA's links to US Senator Joe Lieberman had a hand in Thrill Kill's cancellation due to the latter's strong stance against violent video games. What's even crazier is that EA never told Paradox employees about the game's cancellation. Instead, the employees found out about it through news articles on the internet. Thrill Kill would end up getting reskinned and have elements of it reused to produce other fighting games developed by Paradox, including Wu-Tang Shaolin Style, Rock'em Sock'em Robots Arena, and X-Men Mutant Academy 1 and 2. Also, in what could possibly be seen as an act of protest against EA, Thrill Kill's developers would upload the game to piracy sites. Unsurprisingly, it quickly became one of the most downloaded ROMs around that time.
Imagination is the Only Escape was an unreleased game for the Nintendo DS created by British developer Luc Bernard. The game appears to have reached early development stages, with a small UK software company called Alternate, who would go on to dispute media reports that the game was being blocked by Nintendo. The game failed to reach crowdfunding goals in both 2013 and 2021, making it pretty unlikely that it will ever see the light of day. Imagination is the Only Escape was intended to be an educational title that would inform children about the Holocaust by putting them in the shoes of a Jewish boy named Samuel, who was present at the Veil d'Ivre Roundup, a mass arrest of Jews that took place in Paris on July 16, 1942. While Samuel is able to escape occupied France with the help of a priest, his mother unfortunately doesn't make it, which leads to the boy teaming up with a fox named Renard, who claims to be able to bring his mother back to life. This New York Times article we found on the subject quotes Bernard saying, quote, "I hope that young children will play it," though also implies he leveled complaints at Alternate for asking him to remove swastikas from the game.
With that said, welcome to the dangerous layer of the iceberg. The purpose of this layer is to document items, people, or groups with malevolent intentions. Whether the goal is to spread a hideous ideology, damage your personal property, or simply created by people who themselves would conduct their own tragedies, entries on this layer are a bit extra hard to talk about because of the real-life implications. I'm no longer documenting things about a disturbing game with fictional but uncomfortable subject matter, but rather how a game or its creator impacted the reality you and I live in, usually for the worst. With that said, welcome to the dangerous lair. Viewer discretion is advised.
This may just seem like another bizarre, over-the-top, bloodthirsty Doom mod, but there's quite a lot in the details. Chris Dorner was a US Navy Reserve officer and former LAPD officer who targeted other members of the LAPD and their families. He declared unconventional and asymmetric warfare in response to his firing from the police force following an investigation by the LAPD Review Board, who concluded that Dorner had lied about his trainer. According to Dorner, this trainer engaged in excessive force against an individual. Starting on February 3, 2013, Dorner committed several murders, the victims of which were police officers and the daughter of a retired police captain. On February 12, 2013, the LAPD found Dorner in a cabin near Big Bear Lake in the San Bernardino Mountains, leading to a standoff that is subject to controversy even to this day. The facts of the situation are disputed, but in the end, the cabin Dorner took refuge in was burned down either intentionally or not. Dorner passed away as a result. The LAPD also rammed another car that officers claim matched the description of Dorner's truck and fired upon the driver, who luckily walked away mostly unscathed. In another mistaken identity, Emma Hernandez, age 71, and her daughter also had shots fired at them by the LAPD for driving a vehicle similar to Dorner's. This shoot first and ask questions later approach makes it hard to trust the reports delivered by the organization. Getting back to the game, Chris Dorner's Last Stand is basically a wacky reimagination of the events that occurred at Big Bear Lake. In it, you play as Dorner, with your objective being to survive by taking down waves of cops. As time goes on, the cabin will become more and more engulfed in flames, which actually happened during the real-life standoff after officers had fired burners or pyrotechnic tear gas canisters into Dorner's cabin as a means of luring him out. You even encounter former California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, who finished his term roughly 2 years prior to these events and the mod's release. The game includes some racist and questionable design choices. For example, the names of the skill levels. Also, you can replenish your health by consuming buckets of KFC chicken. One of the songs that gets played is called Yeah. This track comes from the soundtrack of the 2007 mockumentary Gangsta Rap: The Glockumentary. Some of you may have heard it in some memes, such as a mashup with Gary's poetry segment from SpongeBob, where he appears to be rapping the lyrics. What's the song's connection with Dorner? Your guess is as good as ours. Chris Dorner's Last Stand is a creation from 4chan, which apparently had users that were fascinated with Dorner. One user even went as far as to place a Domino's pizza order to the cabin where Dorner was trapped. Again, this game is ridiculous and pretty goddamn racist, but what makes it rather disturbing is its release date. The earliest mention of the game that we could find comes courtesy of a Reddit post dated February 12, 2013, the day of Dorner's death. To add on, allegedly some versions of the game contain pictures of corpses and gross stuff with animals. It is worth noting that his remains hadn't been recovered until February 13th, and medical examiners would confirm the remains were Dorner on February 14th. Just given the nature of this Doom mod, plus the timing of its release, yeah, this is pretty deranged.
You know how in a previous entry we talked about how the story of Kamushiki Village was a parody that decades later got mistaken by Americans for something much darker? The Aumnet BBS Games are basically that, but the real deal. Its only documented evidence is leftover ads from an edgy, controversial Japanese gaming magazine, Game Aurora. The cult in Japan had more of a presence than just a temple. In fact, they even had computer stores which, according to the ultra-healthy video game nerd on YouTube, even sold their stock at a higher discount than what their competitors offered at the time. Along with this interest in electronic sales, the cult made simple minigames and screensavers, which served to reinforce the authority of its leader, Shoko Asahara, while being a tool to educate about proper praying methods. Naturally, after the cult used sarin gas to attack a subway, leaving 14 dead and others injured, anything that was not critical of the cult had a high level of scrutiny placed upon it. So as of now, the only evidence that these games exist is a few screenshots and references from a pornographic magazine.
KZ Manager, to put it bluntly, is a business management simulator where the business is running a camp in World War II. Created in 1988 for the Amiga, Commodore 64, MS-DOS, and eventually Windows, KZ Manager found its way floating around Austria and Germany in the 90s. In response, many countries widely banned it. The game has been indexed by the German Federal Department for Media Harmful to Young Persons and was confiscated in October 1990, meaning it's completely illegal to sell in that country. That did not stop the distribution of this game, which was still available via underground sales and over the internet, thanks to the usual suspects, likely still pining over the good old days. There are a few scenes found in the game, but most of it is just menus where the real horror of the game is found. You need labor to generate money, but if you fail to kill, public perception of you drops. However, you need money if you want to keep operating the camp effectively. Basically, it gamifies the atrocities of World War II, specifically to make the ideology more palatable to white teens.
The Harris levels are a series of now mostly lost Doom WADs created by one of the Columbine kids, Eric Harris. This mega WAD would have contained multiple levels, including one that allegedly looked like Columbine High School, which is either lost media or possibly doesn't even exist, as there's not much evidence online supporting that it's out there. The reason for this is that as the news started to report on the tragedy that happened at Columbine, Doom World was under a lot of heat, and as the main distributor of these WADs, removed all of Eric's creations. In the same vein, archival sites at the time refused to archive media, especially anything related to the school itself. Eric's levels were eventually referenced again by the Doom World's 10 Years of Doom infamous WAD list. This is what they had to say about it. After it was discovered that the pair played Doom, many avid Doomers found their computer and gaming habits placed under scrutiny. The WAD itself, Harris's most elaborate, is unremarkable except for a few now chilling features. The monsters have brand new death graphics doused in added blood and gore, and the text file's admonition of "kill them all," which would normally be nothing more than adolescent juvenilia, carry a certain premeditatory weight now. The YouTuber Utter Spartan also plays one of the archive levels in his Going Through Doom World's Top 10 Infamous WADs 14 Years Later video, which I've seen a number of times and highly recommend. All of Eric's other levels can be found floating around on the archives. In our opinion, the phrase "now chilling features" pretty much describes these WADs exactly. In terms of technical achievement, they're nothing special, but when you remember the tragedy that happened only a little bit after conducted by the person who made it, it takes on a whole new horror.
Lostboy.EXE is a maze/walking simulator style game, which was posted to 4chan's X and V boards in 2012, and consequently almost led to the permanent banning of embedded images site-wide. Initially developed to capitalize on the success of Slender, the 8 pages, the original Lostboy.EXE was a simple maze without a solution. The game contained no jump scares, though the OP claimed that, quote, "it might be too deep or too spooky for you." Notably, the original version of the game was completely safe to run. Hours later, an imposter began to mass share a different link containing to be Lostboy.EXE, but was in fact an embedded .jpeg containing malware. This particular malware is known as a reverse access Trojan, or a backdoor rat, which gives the attacker remote access to infected computers. Victims who followed the link found no game, and instead had their personal data compromised, including phone numbers and banking information. The hacker even went as far as to leak this information in a pastebin page linked to the same boards where the game had initially been posted. Admins responded by deleting threads pertaining to the game and creating this helpful sticky post, reminding everyone not to download anything at all off of 4chan. It's good advice, but it didn't come quickly enough for some unfortunate anons.
We have been unable to uncover much about this entry, so take anything said here with a grain of salt. Robert Steinhauser is another person who, in the year 2002, attacked a school with his focus mainly being the faculty. It was said that he enjoyed Half-Life, Counter-Strike, and Doom, and even made WADs for the latter. I've been unable to uncover any screenshots of these WADs, or really any information outside of Reddit posts, but considering this happened in Germany over 2 decades ago, it's likely some things just got lost to time.
Schnellonline is a graphical chat room allegedly originating from the deep web, which advertised itself as a service where drug dealers, people of extreme views, and trafficking circles could communicate safely. Each player is given a random avatar and is allowed to traverse the trippy rooms and hallways Schnell offers, some even containing Nazi iconography. For a while, all that existed of the game was a few recordings and images originating from 4chan's paranormal board. However, recently, the YouTuber Seedbutter in his video Schnellonline The Full Story got into contact with someone connected to the development and found out that the game is not really online at all. In reality, Schnell was a game that could only be downloaded off of the dark web, and was specifically designed to appear as though you wandered into some possibly illegal territory. NPCs would have simulated conversations while the player was unable to chat at all due to being too new. The conversations were meant to trick the player momentarily, but it would become pretty evident for those that know a bit about computers, especially if you were the type to browse the dark web, that the game was not connected to the internet. The game, as of now, has seemingly been abandoned, and copies in theory might exist, but as of now, it's considered lost. We recommend you check out Seedbutter's video for a more in-depth explanation behind this game.
Resistance Records is a white nationalist record label that was founded by musician George Birdie in Windsor, Ontario, Canada in December of 1993. In addition to music, the label also released video games that also promoted white supremacist ideology. One of said games is Ethnic Cleansing, or EC as we will call it, which you may have heard of before. The National Alliance, which is a neo-Nazi organization which Resistance Records is linked to, produced the game and has their iconography appear all throughout it. EC is a 2002 first-person shooter game that runs on the Genesis 3D engine. The player roams around 2 different levels, killing enemies that come in the form of African American, Latino, and Jewish people. Of course, the racist and anti-Semitic elements and themes don't stop there, as you hear the sounds of monkeys howling whenever an African American is killed. You can choose to play as a Klansman, skinhead, or the Aryan White Will. There were plans for a game based on the novel The Turner Diaries. It would have likely been similar to EC, having non-white people as enemies, but instead of simply using a rifle, the game would have involved the usage of biowarfare, nuclear and chemical weapons. While the Turner Diaries game never materialized, Resistance Records did release another game in 2003 called White Law. It's a lot more of the same. You play as a lone wolf, this time an ex-SWAT officer named Michael Riley, attempting to take back the new American capital creatively called Capital City, with a K, from a government established by the Equality Police. If you're curious as to what happened to Washington, D.C. in this scenario, it was destroyed by terrorists, because of course. Ex-Officer Riley must kill until Capital City is a utopia for the usual suspects. Resistance Records would then follow up with another couple of first-person shooters in Zog's Nightmare, which had been discussed on the channel before, and Zog's Nightmare 2: The War Continues, which were released in 2006 and 2007 respectively. These games have a distinction from the aforementioned ones in that the enemies are soldiers rather than civilians. Still, the message is very much present. If it's not clear, these games suck, are riddled with bugs, and are the racist version of a God's Not Dead movie where the focus is on the message as opposed to deriving any sort of commercial success or fun. The fact that these and some other racist games have potentially played a role in spreading such ideologies to the youth is quite sickening. William Luther Pierce himself lauded EC, boasting about its sales, the fact that 90% of the buyers were white teenage boys, and even touted the game as a medium for the message, seeing it as a pipeline for said white teenage boys to join the National Alliance when they come of age.
Sad Satan is a miserable, disorienting walking simulator made popular by the YouTube channel Obscure Horror Corner. Allegedly, this was a game created by a deep web user using the pseudonym ZK. You walk down monochromatic corridors while the game plays distorted audio of songs and interviews with killers like Charles Manson, distorting or playing backwards to add to the unease. The game also flashes distressing images at you while you're walking, and in the earliest versions, some of those images were actually CSAM, which understandably led to a stark and visceral response.
There's big subwoofers on the side now too, that's really fucking weird. Fuck. Alright, now... Alright.
Obscure Horror Corner, in an interview with Kotaku, claimed that he intentionally misdirected people away from the real link to Sad Satan to prevent people from accessing the illegal material present within. 18 minutes after the interview went live, a clone version of the game was uploaded which did in fact contain illegal material and graphic corpse photos. A sanitized version of the game was produced in response, removing the problematic content. Created in 2015, this project came out at the height of deep web horror popularity, and is almost certainly edgy media going way too far to appear horrifying. While I don't think this game is actually indicative of a greater conspiracy, someone had to find that material, and put it into a package that made its rounds back in the day.
Before we talk about Drowned God, it's important to understand the main man behind the project, Richard Horne, also known as Harry Horse. He was a prominent Scottish political cartoonist, a children's book author who even managed to get his own series on the air, and a conspiracy theorist who, in the year 2007, at least in my personal opinion, most likely killed his wife, pets, and, well, let's just say he ain't around either. Harry found himself at the center of his own conspiracy when it was initially reported that he and his wife, Mandy, died in a Romeo and Juliet-style execution in each other's arms in bed. In reality, his wife was stabbed 30 times so violently that the blade broke, and a second one had to be swapped in midway through. Then his pets were killed in similar fashion before Harry suffered a number of stab wounds and mutilations. It is disputed by some whether or not these are self-inflicted, but it appears to be that way. This initial reporting was disputed by Mandy's family, which is how we, the public, got further details on what actually happened. There are no official reports outside of what was revealed by the families. There are a lot of unknowns here, which honestly begs to be investigated further by officials, but for some reason they just aren't, leading to many people having their own theories and conspiracies. For example, Harry's sister described his final moments as an act of bravery, which, at least from what the evidence says, is far from reality. If he did kill his wife, then in reality it's hard to find anything in his discography that overshadows the way he chose to end his legacy. In speaking of Drowned God. Created in 1996, Drowned God is a point-and-click adventure game designed by Harry Horse about the ancient aliens conspiracy theory. Watching old interviews that he did around the time makes the entire production sound unhinged.
The whole mystery of Drowned God is based on Atlantis and the position of these star constellations that form the same constellation as the Giza pyramids, the ground layout.
Even so, everyone seems very passionate about the topic, using the game as a way to promote the idea that aliens have guided us throughout all of history, both biblically and even relatively recently. The game itself is very atmospheric and is very much a product of its time. Still, some describe this as the most creepy and psychedelic experience ever made, especially when this could be the product of a brutal murderer, a product that currently costs $24.99 on the Epic Games Store. Before you guys click off this video, I would like to quickly explain where I have been the last couple of months. At the beginning of 2024, I was informed that my mom has stage 4 pancreatic cancer, and long story short, I just wanted to show her that I could take care of myself. So in response, I got my driver's license, my first car, and into my first major car accident. In between, I was holding part-time jobs so I could make ends meet. I can say beyond a reasonable doubt that if it wasn't for the amazing people on Patreon and those who have been watching the channel during my hiatus, I would be in a far worse spot off than I am now, and I wouldn't have been able to take the time to really better myself as a person. So for those of you who have been donating on Patreon or hanging out in the Patreon server or just watching the videos over the last 7 months, me and my family would like to thank you for all the support and help you have given me. Starting with the next video, we're gonna bring back the Patreon wall of names, and if you happen to have donated but stopped donating in the interim between my uploads, feel free to reach out to me and I'll make sure that you get included at the donation tier that you supported me at. Really, I can't thank you guys enough because you got me through some pretty scary bills, especially with what my family is dealing with at the moment. I've had some pretty hard times. The world's been looking scarier with each passing day, but the one thing that does bring me joy is when I get a new comment on this channel and someone's just saying that they like something stupid I created. And for that, I'd like to thank you. I've been your host, DCR, signing off.